This is the BrainChip podcast. Hear from our thought leaders about neuromorphic computing, beneficial AI, and how BrainChip's Akita is pushing AI to the edge. This podcast is a place for investors, practitioners, and anyone interested in the future of AI.
Hi all, I'm Rob Telson, Vice President of Worldwide Sales at BrainChip. Welcome and thank you for joining our latest episode of our BrainChip podcast series. These events are structured to provide current and future investors and those interested in AI and the BrainChip technology a path to better understand who we are, what we are doing, and where we are going. If you have not listened to any of our podcasts, please go to our website at www.brainchip.com. Go to our media tab and select podcasts. You can also listen to any of these podcasts on your favorite podcast platform, or please go to our YouTube channel at BrainChip Inc. and find all of our podcasts and additional media. Today, we have the pleasure of spending some time with Jerome Nadel. Jerome is our Chief Marketing Officer here at BrainChip. He's extremely well known for his in-depth and keen understanding of technology, with experience in semiconductor, software, and security. Jerome has enjoyed a very successful career by taking charge and addressing challenges and opportunities head-on and making great things happen. At BrainChip, Jerome is doing just that, expanding on opportunities and breaking down barriers to transform BrainChip's neuromorphic technology into the computational foundation at the edge. That's right, folks, the computing revolution has begun. Jerome, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Rob. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us today, Jerome. And for our listeners, I've had the pleasure to work closely with Jerome over the last 6 months. You know, we're talking about a guy who's laser focused and with the drive to make BrainChip the de facto standard in AI. Nothing gets in Jerome's way. What excites me about today's conversation is having the opportunity to dive into Jerome's mindset and for all of us to truly understand the time and energy that is put into leading the next wave of our marketing organization here at BrainChip. So Jerome, why don't you take a moment and provide our listeners with a bit of background on yourself?
Great. I guess I could go back to the beginning. You know, I'm truly international as I have a French mother and a father that was New York based. I was made in France, but born in the US. So had that sort of international flair. And as I go through, I've lived and worked in France twice later in my career. I grew up an athlete. I was a runner and I still love competition. I'm an avid cyclist. I've been racing. I won the US Masters National Championship, won the California State Championship a set of times. And, you know, you talked about things not getting in my way. You'll recall that we were going to do this recording a couple of weeks ago, but I had an accident that broke 6 ribs, 5 being pretty severely displaced. So that got in the way of our conversation, but I'm on the mend and yeah, it's really good to be speaking with you. I studied psychology and went into an advanced degree back in the day in sort of an esoteric area that was called applied experimental psychology. When I came out of graduate school, I focused on, back in the day, what was referred to as human factors psychology. Then called usability, and then in the new millennium, you know, called user experience. And I'm going to carry that theme because my view of technology definitely comes from an end user's perspective and looking at use cases that end users do and how technology supports that. Early in my career, again, I came out of graduate school as a researcher, but quickly sort of crossed the line into marketing, where I was working at Unisys. I had been at IBM prior, but I was working at Unisys and did some presentations to senior management on the research that we were conducting. And they said, you ought to use this as a narrative for the differentiation of our product. And I think early on, that sort of expanded my view of how tech and storytelling go hand in hand. You know, being able to describe why tech is good as it enables people to do things that arguably have value in a business case. Moving forward, I jumped deeper into interface design back in the 80s and 90s, and then crossed again over to a series of chief marketing officer roles. Each time telling the stories of how technology supported what end users were trying to do. Had some success along the way. There were 2 companies that were sold. I came into a division of an acquiring company. We divested that, sold that. And then back in 2012, with the CEO that I had worked with before, I was asked to join Rambus, another semiconductor play, more in the memory interface space, and came to the Bay Area for the first time living in my life, which I absolutely adore. In fact, I was living in Paris, living and working in Paris prior to that. Things went well at Rambus. It was a bit of a brand turnaround. We'll talk about branding as we go through. And I actually, in the latter part of my tenure there, took a role as general manager of a division that we sold to Visa. And I took an early retirement to play more and ride my bike. And then, I've known Sean a bit. We're both connected to the Silicon Valley Executive Network. And he had shared in confidence that he was looking at a position with an AI startup, wouldn't disclose who it was. One thing led to another. And 6 months ago, I joined BrainChip. And I'm just delighted to be here.
Yeah, Jerome, thank you for that. And the amazing thing is, as I said earlier, you've done some great things. And for folks that want to truly understand Jerome's character, you just spend some time learning a little bit about his cycling and what that means to him, true passion there, and the success he's had with that. So I know whenever I get an opportunity to really sit down with Jerome, I'd love to hear about what races he's competed in, the successes that he's had. And unfortunately, as you mentioned before, a little bit of a biking accident, but something tells me that's not going to slow him down. So let's talk about your first 6 months at BrainChip. So why don't you give us a little view in regards to what you've experienced, where it's taken you from that end?
Sure. I always, and obviously in the discussions about, the opportunity to join, with deference and respect, I try to understand how a company got to where it is. So with Peter Vandermeid and Anil Mankar, these are some brilliant co-founders here. There was a foundation of technology, and we could credit Peter and team for leading on that, the neuromorphic pathway, if you will, and then Anil being to codify that into product, into an architecture that could be deployed as intellectual property. But my view coming in is really more sort of step back thematic. I think if we look at the last couple of decades, digital used to be hard to use. The beginning of digital, you were tethered to a keyboard, or even prior to that, you had cards that ran through a track, and that's how you interfaced with the digital computer behind. If we look at the last couple of decades, the last decade especially, sensors have made digital easier to use. We no longer have to be tethered again to a keyboard or a mouse to interface with digital. We walk by a thermostat and it automatically knows that we're at home. We gesture, we speak, we act in the physical world, and there's a magical interface with how we engage with technology. And you look today, an iPhone has 7 sensors in it. A 2022 car has 70 sensors in it. So sensors, I think, have really become the trend that have simplified, that have blurred the line between physical and digital. And the next big wave is absolutely making these sensors smarter. So sensors improve the elegance and efficiency and how we interact with digital. Smart sensors are going to really blur that line and make it like we walk around, space and time, and the environment understands who we are, what we're doing, and brings all of digital intelligence back to us. So that's a context that excited me coming into BrainChip and seeing how this technology could have such a dramatic impact on society. When I arrived, I knew that BrainChip is a unique company because it's well funded as it went through IPO and has capital to carry forward, but it still had a lot of sort of exciting, exuberant startup dynamic within it. And from a marketing perspective, there was opportunity to systematize, to challenge the executive team and beyond to say, what is our purpose? What are we doing? What is our go-to-market? And that first step, we called it rebrand, but it was really an opportunity to connect with the influencers in the company and get their individual stories, and then bring that together, codify that to say, what is a common record of truth? How do we all see the company, where it's come from, where it is, and where it can be?
Jerome, this is great. Keep going. This is really good. Thank you.
So these interviews and the insights that came out of them were just fabulous. And what we needed to do at this point was sort of coalesce the perspectives that we were hearing, both from a voice of customer perspective, from a technology perspective, from a research perspective, and bring them into a more simplified talk track. The notion of neuromorphic is a bit esoteric and not understood by many. What we came to was the notion of essential AI, coming back to smart sensors, essentially suggesting from a perspective of sparsity or regions of interest, that we don't need all of the information coming from any type of sensor. We need what's meaningful. And we process that efficiently with a low power envelope. So the notion of essential AI spoke to essentiality of the data that's being captured and how we could make, with our neuromorphic architecture, sensors smarter, but also a sort of data pipe that is efficient and can be easily implemented. We moved this forward, and on May 9th, we came out with the full rebrand. So obviously the website was updated with new content and graphical style. The talk track, our narrative and position in market was also refined. It's exciting to share that the feedback that we've gotten from our customers, our prospects, and the market has been really superb. And our exec team is enthusiastically aligned on our positioning and our future. So this is a great step forward.
Yeah, one of the things I really, really want to emphasize here, and Jerome brought this up a couple of times in this conversation so far, sensors. And the fact of the matter is there are more and more sensors being applied to our everyday lives. There's hundreds of them in vehicles. They're in our phones. They're in our devices in our home. They're in industrialized applications. And the fact that taking what we've done at BrainChip in an IP and licensing that IP to device manufacturers and getting the design into the sensor is key, because what we're on the path to do is proliferate this technology everywhere. And that's what gets us really, really excited. So Jerome, why don't we take a moment and talk about some of the news we've had regarding BrainChip launching its new AI enablement program. Can you explain the program and the benefits to potential customers?
Sure. I was just on early morning with an analyst based in the UK today, being in California early morning for me. And he described himself as deep tech, and that we are in the deep tech space, and we are. But as I said, my point of view as a design thinker, as someone who looks at end user experience, is our deep tech is meaningless to an end user when they sit in a car and are identified and speak to it and gesture. They're not thinking deep tech, they're thinking end user experience. So the notion of AI enablement is, I think, often companies that are highly technical begin a conversation around technology. What sensor, what network, what model? And then speaking in a language of inference performance, power envelope, which is going to be meaningful in technical evaluation, but it doesn't focus on the use case that our prospective customer is trying to address. Let me step back for a moment. One of the important collaborations we've had, Rob, between marketing and sales is the discussion of an ecosystem map. And we collaboratively laid out our key targets, and we could talk about large scale OEMs that would design their own SoCs, chip designers and chip vendors. And these are obvious targets who would take a license in the type of architecture that we provide. But at the other end of the continuum, we talked about, respectfully, the notion of simple customers that have products that are looking for AI enablement. And we acknowledge that they're probably looking for a discrete component to make their product better, to differentiate it better, and would not, embark on actually designing their own chip to do that AI enablement. But they're valuable to us in the overall ecosystem. So part of marketing, and I think often people look at marketing as very downstream. It's about comms, it's about promotion, it's about demand and lead generation. Marketing is equally upstream. It's about strategy, it's about positioning, it's about go-to-market. And a lot of these discussions that we had about this ecosystem said, all of these entities are important, but some are going to lead to opportunity sooner, and some are going to benefit later. And when we talk about the big vision of BrainChip, we're going to be in those simple customers' products that are sensor laden. And we start sort of at the top right, but we know we're going to go, down to the bottom left. So we need to be thinking in that way in how we're positioning our technology and making sure that we're building this ecosystem so everybody gets the opportunity to improve, not just the large leaders who are going to be the first adopters, the early adopters, but this is going to trickle down because, again, smart sensors are the next wave.
That's right. That's right. Well said. Well said. Jerome, earlier in the year, Mercedes launched their EQXX concept vehicle, in where they announced that they were using BrainChip's Akita to maximize power savings. You're looking beyond this exciting news. What does the future look like for BrainChip's Akita for automotive applications?
So that was remarkable for me, firstly, because we were in discussions about joining, and there was a span of me accepting and then the news coming out around Mercedes at CES. And it was, if anything, confirmed that I had made the right decision to be part of the team. It was in part that. And, Mercedes is so cool in this way, because not only was this, the first EV that could do 1,000 kilometers per charge, or they've just exceeded that, but they were looking at every milliwatt within the car, not just battery usage and transmission, but everything that they do, because power was essential there, power and end user experience. And, obviously our contribution in that vehicle was in cabin, the category of in cabin. And there's been a lot over the last set of years in how people engage within the cockpit of a vehicle. So, the notion here, and again, it was what we would speak to in a more technical sense of keyword spotting, that a user, a driver, could come into the vehicle, their voice, as in all of its attributes of sort of phonetic tonality, could be recognized with a finite set of words, and you could interact with the car through voice command. But clearly that's a subset of all of the interaction. And, we've got nice demos that describe the notion of detect that someone has entered the car, recognize my face, recognize my voice, recognize my hand and the gestures that I create. So that first category, and again, what was highlighted with Mercedes was just that of, if you will, sort of single sensor, single mode, is, let me interface in the most efficient milliwatt way with voice command. But the next phase of in-cabin is integrating all of these multiple sensors and having it feel so natural that when I just get in the car, it adjusts to me and my preference because it recognizes me. And this, this is really the future over here, that wherever we go, things tune to us because there's sensors that are smart in the environment. We're authenticated, we're permissioned, and our environment is optimized. So that first category would be in cabin. And we're demonstrating that we're in that space. The next is obviously vehicles over the last set of years have, what's referred to as assisted driving. There are sensors that support vision. And when you're, again, maybe a little bit tired or not paying attention and you begin to cross lane, you're going to get feedback in the steering wheel that says, hey, be careful. So there are sensors around the car that are assisting the way a driver is driving to improve safety. And here's another space. And again, architecturally, Akita is close to each of these given sensors. That sensor captures data from surround And already the AI inference occurs at the sensor. And inference, sorry to use a fancy word, but inference metadata is passed forward and integrated to be meaningful in the car, in a system level optimized way. So Akita has an absolute place when we look at assisted driving or vision-based sensor driving. And then finally, the next state that everybody's excited about is autonomous vehicles. And, as I have a camper that I love, and I just can't wait until that thing is autonomous. So I could just get in the back and play and get from here to there without even, ever sitting in the cockpit. So autonomous, again, there's a lot of regulatory ramifications of safety and the like, and there's a lot of compute. And the model that's been adopted in this first sort of generation of autonomous vehicle thinking is basically sticking a server in the trunk to do the compute that's capturing data from the car and interfacing with systems and infrastructure outside the vehicle. So, I think it's magical to most people, but if we look at the amount of processing that's going on, the amount of energy that's used to do that, it's astronomical. So once again, when we apply this architecture that, we're adopting this, if you will, neuromorphic sparsity Akita approach at every sensor, sending forward the answers, the metadata, the inference metadata, not the raw data, and then capturing that and integrating it. Architecturally, it's so much more efficient and elegant that it's a no-brainer that this is the way this should be designed in the future. So we look at in-cabin, we look at assisted driving, and ultimately we look at autonomous driving. And we're working on some great sort of thought leadership pieces around that. Not just touting BrainChip. We're really part, and you use this language a lot, we're part of a movement saying that, the step down approach that made deep learning AI in the cloud in data centers is not the same approach that we should deploy at the edge. We need to think different at the edge. We need to focus on what's meaningful and not rely on more compute than we need, not rely on more power than we need. We need to be efficient. Again, I come back to that notion of essential AI.
Yeah, this is spectacular. And again, for our listeners, you really have to take a moment to process what Jerome has just highlighted. All these different facets within the vehicle. There's so many different opportunities in which we're focused on, and how impactful Akita and BrainChip's technology will be as all of this, I call it the revolution or the movement, continues to go in this direction. But one of the things that is at the fundamental baseline of all this is the fact that our technology is not dependent on the cloud. And Jerome, I know you highlight this a lot. You're screaming at the world saying, this is big because we are not dependent on the cloud. Do you want to just take a moment to talk about that, please?
Sure. And, there was a bit of provocation at that point of the launch of our brand. We put out a white paper with the Global Semiconductor Alliance, which is a very meaningful and prestigious group in the semiconductor industry. And we distributed this paper that, edge AI is cloud free. And this wasn't to discount the cloud. Deep learning and big data and finding relationships that we didn't know existed are all attributed to the cloud. So the ability to stuff unending memory and compute power in the cloud, and again, find relationships that we couldn't imagine existed before, have paved the way for advances in every industry. Pharmaceutical, medical, engineering, everything has gotten better by big data compute in the cloud. But even the language of big data, deep learning, sounds heavy. And even we know, finding the hash from a blockchain cryptocurrency perspective, the notion was everybody is racing to get the key to complete a cryptocurrency transaction on blockchain. And they're doing it with brute force. They're doing it with more compute, with more acceleration, with more power. And that's almost been the model. And even, it's almost sci-fi where there are discussions of actually sending server farms into into outer space and other galaxies, because the cost of keeping everything cool enough for the heat that is generated with all this compute. So I think we need to wrap our heads around that we are burning super hot to be able to do this cloud compute. And if we look, even at refrigeration and cryogenic computing, it's actually a category of computing, keeping things down at near Kelvin, so you can actually reduce the temperature and the amount of electrical current that needs to go through for all of this classic convolutional compute. So the notion, again, of the compute that we're advocating is essential and light. It's not heavy, it's not overpowered, it's minimalistic. It begins by focusing on what is meaningful, not focusing on everything. So to just draw this radical dichotomy, at one end you have everything could be meaningful, because you don't know what's meaningful until you find the relationships. And at the other end, you're saying, I'm task specific. I'm asked to do this. I'm going to do it in the most efficient way possible. And in fact, what we've seen is the original approach to edge compute was to step down from cloud or data center compute and lighten that up. And clearly it's been demonstrated to be effective. You have a smaller power envelope, you're being more efficient, but it wasn't a new way, a paradigm shift. The chasm wasn't crossed to think in that way. And again, what I found compelling about this approach is that it is an alternative way of doing the same thing. Again, not trying to look for everything, but focus specifically on what you are looking for. And that could be done in a minimalistic way. So there's two sides of this. And let me digress for a moment. Language like tiny ML or ML, when we talk about AI, to me and for our audience, I think we should separate AI and ML. Okay, ML, is machine learning, and AI is really about inference. So, you have a network or model that is looking for a set of categories, for example, in classification. And you're saying I see a this or that or that or that. And inference happens thousands of times in a day. So when we look at AI on the edge, that's primarily what is occurring. And then every so often, you want to add a new class. And that's when you're bringing in learning. So most learning occurs in cloud. You need to be cloud connected because the algorithms that support the addition of a new category reside in the cloud. So basically you're doing inference at the edge, but you're tethered by requirement to the cloud to do that learning. Again, touting the BrainChip approach, the learning is done in chip, in device, without needing to go back to the cloud. And again, these inferences, if you will, are basic. They're not considered deep learning. Now, we could talk with Peter Vandermeide and the next generations of neuromorphic computing, and he'll argue that there's going to be a point in time where we can do that in cloud. But that's not the space of BrainChip today. We are doing these more basic inferences, doing them with efficiency and high accuracy and low power, but also able to learn autonomous and independent from the cloud. And finally, we've talked about, like with Mercedes, you want to be super low power. Of course, you want the car to go farther. You want the drone to fly farther. You want things that are not plugged in to last longer. And we all know that, like with our mobile phone. But even in an industrial IoT environment, you don't want to be required to be tethered to anything. You want to be able to do modifications local without being required to go back to the cloud. So I'm not anti-cloud, but I think that when we look at this sort of extreme edge, AI and ML, it absolutely should not be required to be connected to cloud. And architecturally, as we look at the proliferation of smart sensors and the amount of data that's going to be generated from everything being smarter and having more data, we just don't have the capacity, even with next generation communications, to be passing all that data around. We need to keep it local, back in the spirit of client server that was sort of introduced back in the 80s. So that's my view on cloud.
Yeah, I think that at the end of this conversation, folks, what Jerome highlighted on the dynamics of the architectures of what's going on. We cannot continue with the architectures of today without designing in technology that allows you to do things independent of the cloud, of how we're doing things. And a lot of great comments there. We really were able to dive in. Just like I said, I wanted to dive into Jerome's mindset. I think we did that. But now we really get to dive deep into the mindset as we head on to our last question here on the podcast. And you know, my favorite one of all. So Jerome, let's talk superheroes. If you could be one superhero, who would it be? And have one AI superpower, what would it be?
You know, there are a lot of compelling superheroes for the powers that they have. I know this is corny, but, you know, my dad died back in the 90s and he had superpowers. So yeah, it would be my dad. And he was just a lover. And there was a famous psychologist, Carl Rogers, and they talk about Rogerian selfless love. And my dad had that. And that'd be a power that I'd like to have more.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's special.
Just
that's
saying it from the heart.
That's special. And thank you for sharing that. Jerome, thank you for your insight and feedback today. It's truly appreciated. On behalf,
so much, Rob.
You know, I'd like to say on behalf of the BrainChip family, and we want to thank you for all that you've done. And we also want to thank all of our listeners, investors, analysts, employees, and everyone interested in learning more about AI, but most importantly, learning about BrainChip. We truly appreciate all of your passion and support. Yes, our podcast series will continue. And until our next podcast, we wish everyone to stay healthy, happy, and most importantly, stay out of trouble.
Thanks for listening to the BrainChip podcast. Please remember to rate and review on your favorite podcast platform.